So good morning, everybody. We have, of course, the test coming up on Tuesday. Now you see it on the Canvas page, so access it through there. Revisit the syllabus to see all instructions pertaining to the test. And if you like, take the practice test, which is there under today's session heading. Download it and play it as a PowerPoint to get a sense of what it will look like. And all the material, of course, up to this class, including this class, will be on the test. Today, we're talking about religion and the 1500s. You see the itinerary. I'm going to begin actually with some historical and contemporary definitions of Britain to summarize some of what I've said, the narrative of British history, and then you see a variety of topics pertaining to religion, focused predominantly around the 16th century. We're talking about Britain, well, as a case study for European cultural history, but also as a distinct subject in the class. There are four things you could say, not exhaustive, of course, hardly, but just a couple of things that have come up that are worth reiterating right now. Britain is four nations, an island, a constitutional monarchy, and a country that once had the largest empire in human history, and I think I've gestured toward all of them so far. Reiterate that idea. Four nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So a precarious creation cobbled together, and of course a very diverse country today. You could even speak about smaller nations, or at least ethnic groups within the country right now. Also an island, something to mention that has come up already, and this is part of the history of the country. I mentioned this already, has not been invaded successfully since 1066. Also has not experienced a revolution since 1688, which is also a long time to go without the forceful overthrow of a government. It's not the case for most European countries. And some people have made the claim that that's caught up with a sort of vaguely constructed island mentality, resistance to change or transformation, the sense of the continuity of traditions, which is of course very big in Britain, whether you're talking about country homes, the monarchy, villages in the Cotswolds, or a variety of different eccentric, quirky traditions, from Morris dancing to town criers. All of those things, I mean, Britain is kind of famous for the range of the different traditional practices and groups that continue to survive. And another point that's been made, although of course we adjust this depending on what period we're talking about, but a suspicion of foreigners or outsiders is a kind of ingrained in the British psyche, especially with relation to the European continent, because there's a sense that Europe is something separate and distinct. The British Isles, or Britain in particular, stands on its own. Great Britain, I should mention, United Kingdom of Great Britain. Great Britain refers to the large island, basically, but there are other smaller islands, including the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands. Usually the islands off the west coast of Scotland are kind of grouped in together. So when they say Great Britain, it basically refers to the big island itself. So constitutional monarchy, which will be relevant when we discuss politics next time. You see Queen Elizabeth II, obviously recently died, the reigning monarch of the UK between 52 and 2022, the longest reigning monarch in British history and the longest serving female head of state in global history. Looks like someone's grandmother, except festooned with all the jewelry and the crown. So Queen was the head of state of Britain, just as now Charles is the head of state of Britain, as well as a series of other countries that were once part of the empire that would retain the monarch as the head of state. But I say there her duties were largely ceremonial. She held no significant political power in the UK government, so too the case for Charles moving forward, and even more so in the various countries ranging from Canada, Australia, Jamaica, who retain the monarch as a head of state. So she doesn't do anything, or did not do anything within the government. Purely a ceremonial position, just a figurehead, an icon of national unity, is supposed to stand for unity, which is precisely why she could not hold forth on any one of a number of political issues, because they're too controversial. They're too divisive. You have different camps and competing viewpoints where she's supposed to just stand for this unity of opinion. So the monarch would really only mention an issue in the interest of charting the middle way. Charles has become a little bit infamous for wading in to a degree on controversial issues, but one of Charles's big linchpins has been climate change, the environment, and well, maybe he truly does, care about those things, believes in it, but it's also a safe issue for a monarch to be involved in because most people agree that we should do something about climate change or protect the environment. So it's a kind of safe issue for the monarch to speak up about. Something else that came up with language. Once had the largest empire in global history, spanning, as I said, 25% of the globe, encompassing a quarter of the population. There you see the empire at its zenith in 1913, just before the war. To reiterate, interesting, a very modern kind of post-industrial era empire in the sense that it's this scatter shot across the planet as opposed to something that grew outward from a single place. And I would say the legacy of the empire pervades the British national psyche today. There's always this looking backward, especially to the 19th century, because that was the period where the empire was really at its high water mark. That was the period where Britain was in many ways an uncontested global superpower, reigning over a large portion of the world, but also holding a significant amount of hegemonic power within Europe as well. And if British people are nostalgic for any particular era, it would be the 19th century, the Victorian period. And yet the legacy of the empire and imperialism is definitely very complicated, and certainly much more so given the disintegration of the empire after the Second World War. That would be in the mid-20th century. So Britain is the kind of country that has had an identity crisis for, 80 years or something like that, because the loss of the empire meant the loss of something that had been really integral to the cultural identity of the country. And I think since then there's been the constant struggle to figure out, well, what's the identity of the nation today, or what's the future place of it in the world? And as I said, legacy of the empire exists with the Queen as the head of state in various countries that were once part of the empire, as well as the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth just refers to countries that were once part of the empire as well. That's the, going back, reiterating some of the details that are, I think, significant to think about when we consider British politics, religion, the economic situation. I mean, those are the different issues we'll be speaking about moving forward. So then, let's talk about religion as the main topic here. And we start with this, Celtic religions and mythology, because that's, as I said before, where we take up the thread of recorded history in Britain, and also the continuation of a genealogy in Britain with people tracing their links back to the Celtic people, especially in Scotland and Wales. As I said before, there were other ethnic groups, other nations prior to the Celtic people, but their genealogy seems to be lost in history, whereas the Celtic one survives. Say their religion before Christianity. Was there religion prior to Christianity in Britain and Europe? The answer is, of course, there was religion prior to Christianity. Probably a whole slew of different religions, actually. Religion is one of those things that appears to be ingrained in the human condition. I brought this up in the first class. Since the time of the cognitive revolution, approximately 50,000 years ago, it appears as though humans have had religious beliefs and ideas. So from the time that we became human, in the modern sense of the term, became Homo sapiens, developed consciousness, underwent the cognitive revolution, well, that coincided with the development of religious beliefs. So you could say that religion is, to an extent, a universal aspect of the human condition. I mentioned that. We can see that by looking at grave sites. That, again, not from the cognitive revolution, but from 6,000 years ago, but burial practices hint at religious beliefs or the idea of some kind of afterlife, some kind of immortality, something that extends beyond just this world and the material and what we can see in front of us. So probably a whole bunch of different religions in Britain for thousands and thousands of years, just like in other inhabited places. The Celtic religion, though, is the one that we know about, the one that has these recorded historical narratives surrounding it, and the Celtic people would have used Stonehenge. Important point, they did not build Stonehenge. That's often a mistake that's made. The Celtic people built Stonehenge. No, it was constructed prior to them, but they likely did use it as a religious site. I mentioned this point as well. They had what we would call a solar religion. It's a pagan religion built predominantly around the equinoxes, which is relevant because the equinox, I think, is tomorrow, actually. Means the sun is directly over the equator, but we typically associate it with the changing of the seasons, and especially the changing of daylight. From this point forward, very relevant to Iceland, it will be darker more than it is light, right? That's what we know from around this time. And I also mentioned this idea before. Really, the idea here is that the changing of the seasons associated with harvests, with crops, when you go into the winter months around this period, then you're really heading into periods of hardship and scarcity, cloudier conditions, shorter daylight, not going to have enough food, and that's certainly the period where people would starve to death. I mean, that would be a typical course. So the religion is built around harvest, it's built around the changing of the seasons, because there's this constant idea of trying to get divine intervention to help them survive the difficult months, to try and secure good harvest. It's basically the idea of most pagan religious practices oriented around harvest and food to stave off famine. It's an 18th century image of a wicker man, which would have been set afire in Celtic ritual practices, which is preserved in various practices in Britain today. There you see the image of the wicker man stuffed with people, actually, so hinting at a religious ceremonial practice that the Celtic people may or may not have engaged in. It's a little bit unclear, but human sacrifice, which is often associated with pagan religious practices. Again, I say a certain lack of clarity about that because that too might be the moralizing dimension. Christians and their perceptions of the pagans saying, oh, you know what they used to do to try and appease their gods. They would commit these different acts of human sacrifice. A little bit unclear, but if they did do it, and these are the contemporary accounts of the time, if they did do it, then perhaps a third of children in a given community would have been sacrificed, so deliberately killed during various religious ceremonies, which likely would have coincided with the equinoxes. Now, if this was actually a practice, then you have to appreciate the kind of this sort of appropriateness and the irony of it underneath it all, because you head into a winter season. Famine is definitely a threat. Not enough food to go around. Okay, so who suffers the most during those conditions? Well, typically children, the young. I mean, those would be the people who would be most at risk in those conditions, just as they were most at risk for any one of a number of other hardships, from infectious diseases to accidents. So those would be the people who would be likeliest to die anyway. So if they were practicing sacrifice of children, it was almost a way to gain control over that process. It's kind of a way of appeasing the gods in a way. Well, if we kill off these children right now, maybe we can save the rest of them, and maybe we can kind of tell ourselves that we're exercising control over this, over something that actually falls outside of our control. So it gives you a sense of the kind of inner pragmatics, which are always interestingly paradoxical underneath it all. The inner pragmatics of a lot of religious practices. So Christianity then. I mean, we talk about the Celtic religion in Britain. That's the precursor to Christianity. And you see what we're going to go through there. And the narrative is going to take us from the beginnings, Christianity in Britain, up through the Reformation. Hence the focus on the 1500s, because that's when the Reformation occurred. And that was one of the biggest events in the history of institutionalized religion. A couple topics: the beginnings of Christianity in Britain, Anglo-Saxon culture, and the Roman Empire, the medieval Roman Catholic Church, power and corruption, the Reformation, Martin Luther, and the Reformation comes to England. You see some flashpoints, major events in the early Christian period in Britain. Christian missionaries may have been converting pagan Irish kings as early as 300 AD, so that's going way back into the past. The Roman Empire did become a Christian empire due to a conversion at a particular juncture. You see, under Emperor Constantine, Dated precisely 314 AD, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. They had their own pagan religion prior to then. So technically, Britain became a Christian nation because it was part of the empire, but that came to an end in less than 100 years due to what I mentioned previously, the disintegration of the Roman Empire. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the Anglo-Saxon invaders, the ones I mentioned before, reintroduced paganism. So when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes came to Britain, they brought their own religion, and it was not Christianity, it was their own version of paganism, and that's because the Anglo-Saxon invaders were not part of the Roman Empire. They were Germanic tribes separate. However, St. Augustine introduced the Catholic faith to the Anglo-Saxon kings, and in 597 he became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. So the period of paganism for the Anglo-Saxons lasted for a time, but Christianity eventually swept over that as well. And I say there in 664, all churches in the British Isles adopted the Catholic form of worship and practice. Probably wasn't a super clean break. They likely combined aspects of Celtic religion and Christianity for a while, creating a bit of a hybridized religion, but eventually it sort of fell within the larger institutional framework of the Roman Catholic Church. I see the historical map showing the spread of Christianity, and note that the pagan religious areas formed a small slice of Europe in the 600s. So by the time you get into the 7th century, you already have Christianity very widespread across the European continent. And we talk about the Anglo-Saxons, for instance. Well, they're making up quite a small minority by this juncture. And thus, it makes a certain amount of sense why this conversion would occur. Might have been for reasons of their own beliefs, ideas, and faith, but probably also for practical reasons as well. The spread of Christianity was soon attached to the Roman Catholic Church, which became the predominant religious institution in Western Europe, and a kind of monolithic institution in its own right. Hegemonic, meaning exercising power and control across all of these different areas. Well, England as a nation, it wasn't even a unified nation. It was actually a group of smallish kingdoms at this time, and all these different kingdoms are looking to consolidate their power and legitimize themselves. The kings are looking to legitimize their rule. So attaching themselves to the Catholic Church was in some respects a strategic move, because they're attaching themselves to a big institution that has a lot of clout and is quite long-standing, has been around for hundreds of years. So it's a way for these small kingdoms in England to really give themselves some concrete weight and authority. They have the backing of a very large church, a very large institution. You can think of it like a small business that's just starting out. Small business doesn't know how long it's going to survive selling furniture or whatever product they're selling. If they get the backing of a big brand name bank, like Barclays or something like that, or HSBC, well, then that really kind of lends some weight to them. They can say, well, look, we have this big brand name that's behind us, and people start to say, oh, well, this business is really on solid footing. Kind of the English kingdoms were like that in a way. Well, the Catholic Church is behind us. The Catholic Church supports us. People say, oh, well, actually, then these kingdoms are probably going to survive for the long haul. And thus the Catholic Church basically encompasses the European continent. Of course, it's the Eastern Orthodox Church if you move further east, but that's a different story. Then you see a kind of revised model of what I showed you before, the old feudal social order which held sway throughout the medieval period. That pyramid structure with the peasants and serfs at the bottom and then all the way up to the monarch. Well, here you have a model which basically places the Pope of Rome and the Catholic Church at the very top end of that, and that certainly would have been the Church's perspective for the majority of the medieval period, well, even after the medieval period as well. We have to appreciate this aspect of medieval European culture. For hundreds of years, throughout that period, all the way up into the 1500s, the Catholic Church is without question the single most powerful, wealthiest institution in Europe, with its appendages draped all across the continent and involved in all aspects of European life. Because remember what I said before, this is a Judeo-Christian religious paradigm. So people view the world through that intellectual paradigm, and thus they're viewing all aspects of life through that paradigm. It's not like religion today where we kind of separate or segregate religion, treat it as this kind of thing that exists over here, and you can be as involved as you want to be with it. No, I mean, during this period, whether you're talking about any kind of knowledge, philosophical knowledge, scientific knowledge, any kind of education, it's coordinated with the church. The ancient universities, Oxford and Cambridge, did exist as far back as the mid-medieval period, the 11th, 12th century. Those are ecclesiastical institutions when they first opened. They do teach other subjects, but they are primarily religious institutions. So too with any kind of medical practice that you might name. I mean, this was especially important during labor, childbirth. Well, the medical procedures that exist are connected to religious ceremonial procedures because they're not making any distinction between religion or any other aspect of life. And so too with politics as well. Hence the reason the Catholic Church would be heavily involved in European politics, coordinating with the various monarchs in the different kingdoms at the time, because religion is just the way of life. It encompasses every single thing they do. The Crusades probably summarize that idea as well as anything. The Crusades were a series of wars between Christian and Muslim nations which stretched from the 11th century to at least the 15th century, perhaps as late as the 18th century, depends where you start counting. The wars, I said, there were sanctioned by the Catholic Church, and participants were often granted indulgences, which guaranteed supposedly a state of grace with God. So a good way to get in the good books with God was to go on a crusade to the Holy Land. This was basically a venture on the part of the European nations to wrest control of the Holy Land, centered around what is now Jerusalem, to wrest control of that back from the Muslim nations. The perception of the church, which was involved in financing and spearheading the Crusades, was that the Holy Land, by definition, belongs to Christians, never mind who's actually occupying the area presently. The different kingdoms in Europe were involved in supporting the Crusades, but the church itself was the kind of main catalyst in bringing about the Crusades. So they're intervening directly in what is basically a military venture of extension and conquest into the Middle East, into the Holy Land. You see a map of the First Crusade routes in the 11th century. I say their early European invasions were successful, largely due to fragmentation and hostilities with neighbors within the Muslim Seljuk Empire. There you see the map of areas captured by the Christian Crusaders as of 1200, although the tide of the war did swing under the leadership of the legendary Saladin, I think represented in some Hollywood films, which helped bring Jerusalem back under the control of the Muslims. I should mention there, too, kind of an interesting thing about the Crusades. The European invaders did not have any real advantage over the Muslim nations when it came to things like military tactics or technology or anything you might mention. There wasn't really a discrepancy or a divide between them at this juncture. European imperialism and colonialism, which enabled the conquest of entire continents. We talk about the Americas, that's a later thing. That comes later. At this stage, Europeans do not have the ability to even invade nearby territory and take it over because they're fairly evenly matched against their counterparts. That's the reason why the Muslim nations ultimately retained control of the Holy Land. Speak about this a giant institution, and on the one hand monolithic and very hierarchical in its organization. As the Catholic Church is today. I mean, it follows that feudal model in the sense that it's very much that pyramid structure with the Pope, bishops, archbishops, all the way down through this giant hierarchy. So monolithic in that sense, but also very diverse in the sense that it's involved in all stages and facets of life. And it has a whole range of different people working within it, from members of the nobility, members of royal families who cannot get on the throne because of the second or third born son, so they end up in the church, but all the way down to country priests, peasantry, people like that. So it's very kind of expansive in that sense. And when you have any giant, wealthy, authoritative institution like this, you can bet that corruption enters the ranks fairly heavily. And that is something that we can certainly see all across the medieval period up into the 1500s. Very corrupt institution in the sense of exercising control over the people, hoarding wealth for its own purposes, individuals within the church who call upon religious doctrine and principles for their own particular gains. All of those things existed certainly across the board in the church. There are some infamous popes, as listed by one writer. We could probably mention some others just to give you a sense of this. Also, the involvement in political affairs at the time. There's Boniface VIII, who was pope from 1294 to 1303. He satirized in Dante's Divine Comedy. That's a famous medieval text that deals with journeys into purgatory and hell, among other things. You say there Boniface VIII was an authoritarian leader who filled the sacred college with his own relatives and favorites. That kind of cronyism, nepotism, basically using position of authority to favor those who are closest to you. Very typical, common practice in the church at this time. Also, the authoritarian leader basically adhering to that principle that the Pope of Rome is the closest person to God in the world, and thus everybody else should be subordinate to this individual. The Pope invested with that idea, which became kind of a sort of, I don't even know if it's still a kind of popular idea in the church, but that idea of papal infallibility, or the idea that the Pope cannot make a mistake, cannot do any wrong. And this was supposed to apply to the monarchs in the various kingdoms in Europe. So you talk about a king or a queen, well, that king rules their own kingdom. It's their country, and yet the Pope of Rome would have the attitude of, well, if I tell a monarch, a king, to do something, then he better do it, because I'm the Pope, I'm the religious authority. So that kind of authoritarian perspective was quite typical. He was the Pope during Edward I's invasions of Scotland, the William Wallace Wars, for instance, and Scotland actually did appeal to the Pope of Rome for support. But as I say there, Edward I effectively ignored his decrees, which was becoming more common among the European monarchs at this time. As time passed, the kingdoms in Europe, including England, generally became more solid in terms of their authority, their consolidation of their power over their subjects, over their people, also the accretion of wealth as well. So the kingdoms were becoming a little bit more unified. And so by the time we get to this period, the late 13th century, the early 14th century, someone like Edward I has the attitude that, no, England is my realm. I don't care what the Pope of Rome says. I mean, Rome is a long way away, right? And it doesn't matter to me, this person who lives in this foreign country issuing these decrees and telling me what to do. This is my country and my land, and I'm going to do what I want. So we can see the conflicts, the clashes developing between religious authorities and monarchs at this time. Alexander VI, Pope from 1492 to 1503, a committed patron of the arts, important in the Renaissance, which I'm also going to mention, but also a lecher and a womanizer who had numerous illegitimate children. Yes, that is the Pope of Rome I'm talking about, and he tried to stalk the Sacred College with some of his relatives. So this is the Pope with various mistresses. He was a Spanish national who also explicitly sided with Spanish interests, including the invasions of the Americas. And that would be typical as well, depending on the nationality of the Pope, so the nation that he comes from. There's a very good chance that he's going to explicitly side with the home country. In this case, he's Spanish, so he supports Spain. And note the dates where he's the Pope, 1492, well, overlapping with Columbus's voyages to the Americas. So when there's the Spanish invasion of the Americas, Alexander VI is all for that, and may even have supported the enslavement of the Aboriginal people, although that point is more ambiguous. Incidentally, his rooms in the Vatican were closed because of his somewhat notorious reputation. They were closed for a very long time after his death. I think only opened in the 1800s. Finally, Clement VII, Pope from 1523 to 1534, perhaps a pious leader, difficult to know, but he inherited the pressures of the Reformation, which we're also going to talk about, and the huge power struggle between the two leading monarchs of Europe, Charles V of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. That was not atypical to have one monarch for two countries, and that's because of the ruling dynasties, the households, and Francis I of France. His indecisiveness in this conflict was a major factor in soldiers sacking and pillaging the Vatican in 1527, which gave you a sense of, yes, not leaving the religious realm on the sideline, but in this case, the soldiers from the Holy Roman Empire, it's kind of modern Germany essentially, and Spain invading the Vatican and sacking the place. And as I recall, Clement VII was taken hostage by those soldiers, and it was only with a handsome ransom that he was finally freed after the fact. So, the Reformation grows out of these things, because you have the Catholic Church, which is the sole institutional authority when it comes to Christianity, at least in Western Europe. But it is in many respects a corrupt institution, but also just an institution heavily involved in the material world. I mean, there's no sense that the church is only concerned with spiritual religious affairs. No, it's involved in everything at this time, and that was the groundwork for the growth of the Reformation. You see a couple of subjects that I'm going to discuss with regard to the Reformation. Again, with the Renaissance, Martin Luther, of course, gives his name to Lutheranism, and Luther's basic ideas about what he's advocating there, less emphasis on the priests and the larger churches, mediation and the use of indulgences, and more emphasis on the individual's faith and relationship with Christ, the translation of the Bible, and then the English version of the Reformation as well. Renaissance played a big role in the Reformation. Without the Renaissance, there probably wouldn't be a Reformation as such. There you see an image of Florence in the 1300s, which is widely considered the birthplace of the Renaissance. I say there, you could speak about the Renaissance in a lot of different ways, but broadly speaking, it was a revival of the practices, ideas, and art forms used in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Said the western portion of the Roman Empire began to fall apart in the 300s. So that's 1,000 years before the Renaissance. The thing that happened is after the fall of the Roman Empire, all of the achievements of that empire, and also the ideas of the ancient Greeks, kind of went underground for a while. I mean, they weren't lost entirely, but they weren't really as prevalent anymore. And that included a whole range of different things, because mentioned before, the sophistication and complexity of the Roman Empire on the level of infrastructure, on the level of its technological achievements, but also just on the level of cultural life as well. We talk about influence on things like science, philosophy, politics, literature, art, I mean, just everything. And as I say, it's not to say that those cultural ideas and practices disappeared, but they weren't really as prevalent throughout the medieval period, and in part because the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks were indeed regarded as pagans or as heathens, so anti-Christian, not fitting within the Christian doctrine. Well, when we get to this period, around the 1300s and thereafter, there is a revival in the interests of all the things from ancient culture, including all the things I mentioned, whether you're talking about their literature, their philosophy, art forms, or even some aspects of their technology. The precise nature and impact of the Renaissance remains widely debated subject in scholarship, though its role in promoting humanism is generally accepted. Humanism kind of focused more on a liberal understanding of the importance of the individual. the importance of the individual's beliefs, ideas, freedom, autonomy. So a kind of individualistic perspective that grows out of a Renaissance thought. I see Martin Luther, a German-speaking Catholic monk, theologian, and philosopher, and his dates. He was famous for composing and distributing the 95 Theses at the University of Wittenberg in 1517, excommunicated by the Church in 1521. Now, how fitting, and also ironic, because I say that history is littered with these ironies and paradoxes, that we talk about all of these different wealthy, powerful people, whether they're monarchs or popes, jockeying for position in these vast power struggles, sacking cities, fighting over these vast tracts of land. But the person who instigated the Reformation was not one of them. He was not this prominent person in society, at least not really. He was, in fact, this overly scrupulous monk and philosopher, not someone who anyone would anticipate could have an impact on the larger workings of the church, because on the surface he's just not important enough. He's just this small individual. But nonetheless, Luther, through his interpretation of religion, not through a power struggle within material society, but through his interpretation of religion, ended up having a definitive impact on people's understandings of religion, and really was the central person, not the only person, but the central person in instigating the Reformation, which was basically a split within the Catholic Church, and in fact, in the end, an entire schism where an entire new branch of Christianity materialized, known as Protestantism, in protest against the Catholic Church. There are probably a lot of things that someone like Martin Luther could have criticized with regard to the Catholic Church, including all of the stuff that I've been talking about, but he focused on one particular aspect of the church that he found really troublesome, which was the over-reliance on indulgences. And this kind of tapped into the idea of the material and even the commercial orientation of the church. Time was that if you committed a sin or you needed to go to the church and confess, talk about something that you had done wrong, well, generally the priest would give the individual a very kind of tangible task to do. In fact, I would say the Catholic Church still kind of works along that principle. So, committed sin, did something bad, go confess to the priest, and the priest will give you a specific thing that you can do. Whether you can say 10 Hail Marys or pray the Rosary or go on a pilgrimage or even go on one of the Crusades, for instance, it's usually this act that you can perform which will help the person achieve a state of grace once again. Now, the kind of underlying rationale to that is that you can't expect the ordinary person, the ordinary illiterate peasant, to really grasp the nuances and complexities of religious faith. So there's this idea of just give them something simple and something that's very action-oriented, because that's something that they can latch onto and understand. But when we get into the period of the 1500s, that movement, that slow, gradual movement toward capitalism is starting to take hold within European society. I mentioned that before, that kind of a paradigm shift and the emergence of a new type of economic system with more of the emphasis on money or the acquisition of wealth. And so commercialization had entered the church's ranks. And increasingly there was this idea that you could obtain absolution, you could obtain a state of grace, not only through some kind of act, but through an act that had a particular commercial dimension attached to it. You could purchase a state of grace ostensibly. You would have individuals known as partners who would go around to different areas, different villages, and they would sell things like saints' relics. They would say, here is the cloth cap worn by a saint several hundred years ago, or here is the bone of this saint who lived previously. Why don't you buy this relic, and thus you can achieve some state of grace just by owning this object? Now, half the time the relic was probably just something scrounged off a rubbish heap or something like that, but this was the kind of idea, and it also entered into the notion of the Crusades as well. People going on crusades with the intention of buying a state of grace. There was this idea within the church that if you went on one of the crusades, went to the Holy Land, fought on the side of the European nations, then you would achieve a permanent state of grace. Now think about the implications of that. It wouldn't matter what you did the rest of your life, right? You could kill people if you want to, but you're good with God just because of this one thing that you did in the past. They even had these kind of rhymes, these ditties. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, which basically invites people, compels people to donate their money to the church in order to liberate their souls from purgatory. Now, it might seem ridiculous to us, but to an extent, that is the way a lot of modern charity functions today. You might have received requests from charitable organizations like the Red Cross saying, well, you can donate such and such amount of money, and it can really make a difference in someone's life, depending on the particular charitable cause in question. And you should donate money because you can make a difference. But there's also this idea that if you want to commit a good deed, you can do so simply and efficiently. That it doesn't have to be complex. Here, just donate $100. And there you'll achieve something positive. Okay, $100, enter the credit card, click, 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 click. There, good. I did something positive, and end of story. That's kind of the similar logic to this. Don't worry so much about, torturing yourself as to whether you're a good person or not. Just do something quick, like giving money to the church, and there, you're a good person. Case solved. So that was the kind of logic that entered the workings of the church. But as I said, the elements of corruption and corrosion factor into this so heavily. Now, the Catholic Church is the only thing that resembles a charitable institution during this period. There are no organized charities at all. So they collect a bunch of money from the people. Does that money actually go to what we would call charitable enterprises? Well, some of it probably does, but a lot of it would go to other causes as well, whether we're talking about building new cathedrals, lining the pockets of priests, financing the crusades, financing the lifestyle of some bishop somewhere. I mean, that would certainly be part of it as well. Collecting money for their own particular purposes. So when you have this kind of system, commercial system, there is certainly the possibility of that kind of corruption, cronyism entering into it as well. And that was what Luther was targeting when he spoke about the need for some kind of reformation of the church. Okay, so let's take the break now. Come back at 10:52, talk about the rest of that.